When a man chooses to live alone, the world often looks at him with quiet suspicion. People assume something must be missing, that he's lonely, broken, or perhaps afraid of love. But solitude, true solitude, is not a punishment. It is a mirror. A man who lives without the noise of constant company begins to hear something deeper, the sound of his own being, and in that space he discovers that solitude is not the same as loneliness. It is not emptiness but fullness. It is the beginning of self-mastery. To live alone is to stand face to face with yourself without distraction, without escape. It's to wake up in the morning and realize that no one else will shape your day but you. There's no one to impress, no role to play, no image to maintain, just you and the silence. And that silence can be frightening because it reveals everything that's been buried under the noise, your fears, your insecurities, your longing to be seen. But when a man chooses to stay in that silence rather than run from it, he begins to see clearly. He starts to notice how much of his life was spent trying to be understood, trying to please, trying to prove his worth. Alone, he learns that worth doesn't need to be proven. It simply is. In solitude, a man discovers the difference between wanting love and needing it. Most people chase relationships because they can't bear to be alone with themselves. They confuse companionship with completion, but a man who lives alone learns that completion is an inside job. He doesn't run from loneliness, he walks through it, he faces it until it dissolves, and what remains after that is peace. The kind of peace that no one else can give or take away. This peace changes the way he sees the world. He no longer looks for validation in someone else's eyes. He no longer bends himself to fit into another person's expectations. He realizes that being alone is not a curse but a classroom. Every quiet evening becomes a lesson in patience, in presence, in acceptance. Every meal eaten in silence becomes an act of mindfulness. Every moment spent with his thoughts becomes an opportunity to understand the patterns that once controlled him. Slowly, he begins to master himself, and that self-mastery doesn't mean becoming cold or detached. It means becoming grounded. It means feeling everything but not being consumed by it. A man who has lived through the fire of solitude develops an inner steadiness, the ability to be calm in the midst of chaos. Because when you've sat alone with your pain, your fears, and your doubts, you stop being afraid of them. You stop seeking others to fix them. You become the one who can hold your own storm with grace. Most people never reach that point because they never sit still long enough. They move from one relationship to another, one distraction to the next, always chasing something outside of themselves. But the man who lives alone has chosen a different path. He is no longer chasing, he's watching, observing, learning. He's not avoiding life. He's meeting it in its purest form, without filters, without noise. In the quiet, he begins to see the beauty in simplicity. The sunlight on his window, the sound of rain, the stillness of the night, all of these become sacred. He begins to see that happiness was never in the company of others, but in his capacity to be fully present with himself. He realizes that being alone is not about being unloved. It's about learning to love without needing anyone to return it. It's about loving life itself. And when he reaches that point, something profound happens. His energy changes. He no longer gives off the vibration of desperation or longing. Instead, he radiates peace. He becomes magnetic, not because he's seeking attention, but because he's no longer dependent on it. People can feel it, the quiet confidence of a man who doesn't need anyone to complete him. Such a man doesn't close himself off from love. He simply stops begging for it. He knows that love is not something to chase, but something to share once it naturally arises. He knows that connection born from need will always lead to suffering. But connection born from wholeness will only deepen joy. So when you see a man who lives alone, don't pity him. He's not lost. He's learning. He's building a foundation of strength that comes from knowing himself. And one day, if love does walk through his door, he will meet it not from emptiness, but from abundance, because he has already found the one person who will never leave him himself, and that in truth is the beginning of real freedom. Society has a strange habit of misunderstanding those who walk alone. When a man chooses a quiet life without a girlfriend, people start to whisper. They label him as cold, distant, or perhaps emotionally damaged. They cannot grasp that solitude could ever be a conscious choice, a deliberate way of living. You see, society fears what it cannot categorize. It doesn't know what to do with a man who isn't chasing someone, who isn't caught in the endless pursuit of validation, who doesn't measure his worth by how many people desire him. From the moment he is young, the world teaches a man that his value depends on what he provides, what he achieves, and who stands beside him. He's told that he must have someone to prove he's lovable, that his success must be shared to be real. But what if a man chooses to step away from that script? What if he decides to live without constantly trying to prove himself to the world? Suddenly, society doesn't applaud him. It questions him because he's doing something far more radical than rebellion. He's living authentically. People find it uncomfortable when a man no longer plays by the unspoken rules of dependence. When he doesn't seek comfort in constant company, they assume something is wrong with him. But what's really happening is that he's peeling away the illusions that most people never question. He's rejecting the idea that happiness is found only in togetherness. He's learning that solitude can be sacred, that silence can be nourishing, that freedom can be far more intimate than any relationship built out of fear or habit. Society loves order. It needs to know where everyone belongs. A man alone disrupts that order. He doesn't fit into the picture of what's expected. He isn't a husband, a boyfriend, or part of a couple to be admired. He's simply himself. That simplicity frightens people because it exposes how much of their own lives are built around performance. Most people are terrified to be alone because it means facing the truth that much of what they call love is actually escape. Escape from their own emptiness, escape from their own silence. The man who lives alone, however, walks straight into that silence. He listens to it. He lives within it until it no longer feels like an absence, but a presence. In doing so, he begins to understand something profound. The reason society judges solitude so harshly is because solitude strips away illusion. When you're alone, you can't hide behind roles or distractions. You meet yourself in raw honesty, and that kind of meeting terrifies most people. It shows them how fragile their identities really are. He also begins to see how much of human interaction is built on fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of not being enough, fear of fading into insignificance. But once a man learns to be comfortable in his own company, those fears begin to lose power. He no longer needs to be constantly seen to feel real. He no longer needs to be constantly loved to feel worthy. That's why society doesn't understand him. He's found a kind of freedom that cannot be sold, controlled, or explained. And in this freedom, something beautiful happens. He stops living to impress anyone. He no longer dresses to be noticed, speaks to be approved, or acts to be praised. He begins to live from within quietly, authentically, without pretense. And because he no longer conforms to the expectations of others, he starts to see the world as it truly is. He sees the exhaustion behind the smiles, the anxiety behind the constant business, the loneliness that hides behind relationships built out of need. He realizes that the man who walks alone isn't lost. He's simply walking without illusion. Of course, there are moments of misunderstanding. There are times when people project their fears onto him, calling him heartless or detached. But what they're really saying is that they can't imagine being whole without someone else. They can't imagine peace without company. Yet, he knows that the ability to stand alone is not a rejection of love. It's the foundation for it. Only when you no longer need someone to fill your emptiness can you truly meet another from fullness. He begins to see that the greatest rebellion isn't loud. It isn't about resisting society with anger or withdrawal. It's simply living in truth. A man who lives alone and at peace with himself is quietly defying an entire system built on dependency. He is proof that you can be complete without possession, that you can experience deep contentment without anyone's permission. Eventually, society begins to notice something they can't quite explain. There's a stillness around him, a quiet strength. He doesn't seek attention, yet people feel drawn to him. He doesn't need to prove anything, yet his presence commands respect. That's the paradox. When you stop needing approval, you naturally gain it. When you stop trying to fit in, you start standing out. So when society looks at such a man and calls him lonely, it's not him they're describing. It's themselves. They see in him the reflection of their own unrest, their own dependence, their own fear of being alone. But he simply smiles because he understands. He knows that the judgment of others says more about their emptiness than his solitude. And so he continues walking his quiet path, untouched by noise, free from the weight of expectation. Because the truth is, a man who lives alone has already found what society keeps searching for: peace that doesn't need an audience. Freedom, it's the word everyone loves to say, but few truly understand. A man who lives alone without a girl friend often appears to have all the freedom in the world. He can wake up when he wants, sleep when he chooses, travel where his heart takes him, and answer to no one. At first glance, that sounds like paradise, but the kind of freedom that comes with solitude isn't the easy, carefree kind people imagine. It's a different kind, one that carries a weight, a responsibility, and a price that not everyone is willing to pay. When a man decides to walk alone, he doesn't just free himself from others. He also frees himself from excuses. There's no one to blame when things go wrong. No one to lean on when life feels heavy. Every decision, every mistake, every quiet night of reflection belongs solely to him. And that's where real freedom begins, not in the absence of limits, but in the ownership of one's life. Yet that ownership can be lonely, because true independence strips away all illusions of comfort that come from dependency. It forces a man to see that he is the author of his own story, and no one is coming to rescue him. Freedom without awareness can become chaos. That's why solitude tests a man. It challenges him to build structure where there is none, to create meaning when there is no one around to provide it. There's no gentle voice reminding him to take care of himself, no partner to validate his worth. He must become both the caretaker and the creator of his life. That takes discipline, the kind that doesn't come from external rules but from inner strength. And in that process, he begins to notice something profound. The more he embraces freedom, the more he realizes how attached the world is to control. Most people want the illusion of freedom, not its reality. They want the appearance of independence while still clinging to comfort, security, and validation. But when a man lives alone, he can no longer hide behind those illusions. He learns to face his desires directly, to see them for what they are. Endless cravings that promise happiness but deliver emptiness. There are nights when freedom feels like emptiness itself, when silence stretches across the room and the mind begins to whisper doubts. It's in those moments that the real test begins, because freedom without inner stability can turn into restlessness. The mind starts to crave noise, attention, anything to distract from the rawness of being alone. But if he resists that urge to escape, if he stays in the silence long enough, he begins to see the other side of freedom, the peace that comes not from having everything, but from needing nothing. He starts to see that freedom is not about doing whatever you want. It's about not being controlled by what you want. To live alone and thrive in it, a man must master his impulses, his emotions, his loneliness. He must learn to choose presence over distraction, growth over comfort, silence over noise. And that's not an easy path, it's the path of transformation, because every moment of discomfort becomes a mirror reflecting who he truly is beneath the surface of habits and desires. The price of freedom is awareness. You can't be free and unconscious at the same time. Freedom exposes you. It shows you your fears, your dependencies, your hidden longings. It doesn't give you peace immediately, it demands it from you. It forces you to build it within yourself. And as he continues living alone, he learns that the price he's paying is not loss, but growth. He's trading the comfort of certainty for the depth of truth. There's a strange kind of beauty in living this way. Without anyone to shape his days, he becomes deeply connected to the rhythm of life itself. He begins to understand that freedom isn't found in isolation from others, but in understanding oneself. He becomes more patient, more observant. He sees that freedom is not loud, it's quiet. It's in the way he takes a breath in the morning and feels no rush. It's in the way he walks through the world without needing to prove his worth. Of course, this freedom can be misunderstood. People might call him detached, emotionless, or even selfish, but he knows that what looks like detachment is actually clarity. What seems like loneliness is deep presence. What seems like selfishness is self-respect. He understands that freedom and responsibility are inseparable, that to live freely means to live consciously, and that kind of living takes courage. It takes courage to be the master of your own time. It takes courage to face silence without flinching. It takes courage to live without constant reassurance, to trust that peace can exist within you even when the world tells you it must come from someone else. Freedom will never feel safe because safety belongs to dependency. Freedom feels uncertain because it asks you to trust life, to trust yourself. In the end, a man who truly understands freedom doesn't seek to escape life, nor does he hide from connection. He simply refuses to be enslaved by it. His solitude becomes his temple, his discipline becomes his strength, and his silence becomes his teacher. The price of this kind of freedom is high. It cost you every illusion you ever held. But what you receive in return is priceless. You receive yourself. There's something deeply misunderstood about men who live alone. People often look at them and assume that because they are quiet, they must be emotionally detached. But that quietness doesn't come from emptiness, it comes from depth. The man who lives alone learns to swim in waters most people never even touch. Without the constant noise of companionship, he begins to hear the subtle movements of his own mind, the whisper of his emotions, the rhythm of his own heart, and as strange as it may seem, that solitude doesn't make him less emotional. It makes him more aware of what emotion truly is. When a man lives without someone to constantly reflect his feelings back at him, he learns to read himself. He starts to see the truth of his reactions, his longings, his fears. Most people are in relationships where emotions are traded back and forth like a currency. They need someone else to feel something. But when you live alone, you don't have that exchange. You have to sit with your sadness until it teaches you something. You have to face your anger until you see what's beneath it. You have to be present with your joy until you understand that it doesn't depend on anyone else. This is where emotional depth begins, not in talking about feelings, but in observing them. In solitude, a man learns to let his emotions rise and fall without trying to control them. He begins to see that emotions are not enemies to fight or problems to fix. They are visitors, each bringing a message about who you are and what you believe. And when he no longer resists them, they lose their power to disturb him. He feels everything, but he's not ruled by anything. That's why men who live alone often appear calm, even mysterious. It's not that they feel less, it's that they've learned how to feel fully without being consumed. The world confuses this with coldness, but it's really mastery. When a man spends time in silence, he begins to understand that emotions are like waves. They come, they go, but they don't define the ocean. He becomes the ocean itself, still deep, vast, and aware of every ripple, yet never shaken by the storm, and it's not an easy thing to reach this state. It takes a great deal of courage to face yourself without distraction. When you live alone, you can't hide your pain behind constant company. There's no one there to comfort you when the memories surface, no one to drown out your thoughts when they grow loud. You're left with only yourself. And in that raw confrontation, you either collapse or evolve. Most men who endure this path learn to evolve. They grow gentler, not harder. They begin to understand others more, not less, because once you've sat with your own suffering long enough, you begin to recognize it in everyone else. The man who has faced his own loneliness becomes compassionate, not cynical. He doesn't need to speak much because his understanding runs deeper than words. When someone else is in pain, he doesn't rush to fix them. He simply listens because he knows the healing power of being seen and understood. That's the kind of emotional depth that solitude creates. Quiet empathy, silent strength, a softness born from endurance. But what makes this depth so rare is that it's earned, not inherited. You can't fake it. It doesn't come from reading or talking. It comes from living through nights when silence feels unbearable, when the walls feel closer than they are. When you start to question your place in the world, and then one day you stop resisting that silence. You stop running from your own heart, and in that surrender you discover something profound. There is nothing wrong with you. The emotions you feared were never your enemies. They were your teachers. They were guiding you back to yourself. Once a man reaches that understanding, his relationship with the world changes. He no longer reacts out of habit. He no longer seeks love out of need. He no longer runs from pain or clings to pleasure. Instead, he moves with life's rhythm, not against it. He becomes emotionally balanced in a way that feels unshakable. Not because nothing affects him, but because everything does, and yet he remains centered. He feels more, not less, but his feelings don't drown him anymore. They enlighten him. When others see him, they might sense a stillness that's difficult to describe. It's the kind of stillness that makes you wonder what he's thinking, but in truth, he's not thinking much at all. He's simply present. He's not trying to analyze the moment or escape from it. He's living it fully with quiet awareness. And that's something rare in a world that's always running from itself. There's a profound strength in a man who can live alone and still remain open. Open to love, open to loss, open to joy, open to the passing nature of all things. His solitude hasn't closed his heart. It has purified it. He's not detached. He's free. And in that freedom, he can finally feel life without fear. He can finally love without losing himself. Because the man who has learned to master his emotions doesn't fear them anymore. He doesn't need anyone else to regulate his peace. He doesn't need anyone else to complete his heart. He's found that the deepest love of all begins within, the quiet love of simply being alive, and that is where true emotional strength is born. Love is not absent in the life of a man who lives alone. It only changes its form. It stops being something he chases and becomes something he radiates. When a man chooses solitude, the world assumes he has turned away from love, that he's too guarded or too tired to open his heart. But that's not true. What he's really doing is learning to love in a purer way, not through possession, but through presence. He's discovering that love is not something another person gives you. It's a state of being that flows naturally when you are at peace with yourself. A man who lives alone learns this truth slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, he might miss the warmth of company, the easy reassurance of shared laughter, the comfort of knowing someone is waiting for him. But as the silence deepens, something shifts. He starts to notice beauty in places he never did before. In the morning light touching his window, in the quiet rhythm of his breath, in the simplicity of making tea alone, these moments become sacred. They teach him that love is not confined to romance. It's woven into the very fabric of existence. He begins to love life itself, not the idea of it, not the drama of it, but the living pulse of it. He feels a kind of intimacy with everything. With the wind, the rain, the sound of the city at night. He realizes that love doesn't need a recipient to be real. It only needs awareness. Love, in its truest form, is the gentle acceptance of what is. When he sees this, the craving for external affection softens. He stops asking who will love me and starts living as if the answer has always been. Life itself does. That shift changes everything. It transforms how he relates to the world. Without the constant need to be loved, he becomes capable of deeper love than ever before, because now his love isn't rooted in need. It's rooted in freedom. He can appreciate beauty without wanting to possess it. He can care without trying to control, and he can let go without resentment. He learns that the purest form of love is not clinging but allowing, and that's something only solitude can teach. This doesn't mean he closes himself off from relationships. Quite the opposite. When love eventually enters his life again, it won't come from emptiness. It will come from overflow. He won't seek someone to fill the void because there will be no void left to fill. He will love because he wants to share, not because he wants to be completed. He will love from abundance, not from hunger. And that kind of love is rare because it's fearless. It doesn't demand, it simply gives. Living alone teaches him that love is not a transaction. Most relationships fall into the pattern of giving to get, affection traded for security, attention given for validation. But he has no one to bargain with in solitude. So love becomes something else entirely. It becomes an expression of his nature, not a currency of exchange. He starts to see that love is not what you do. It's what you are when you're free of fear. And in that realization, he begins to live with quiet compassion toward everything around him. He might smile more often, not because anything special happened, but because he's alive and aware of it. He might feel tenderness for a stranger on the street or gratitude for the smallest things. His solitude has taught him that love doesn't always look like romance. Sometimes it looks like patience, sometimes forgiveness, sometimes stillness. Sometimes it's just the soft understanding that everything and everyone, including himself, is doing the best they can. In a world obsessed with finding love, such a man becomes different. He's not chasing anyone, not performing to be chosen, not hiding behind charm or pretense. His presence itself becomes love, calm, steady, and sincere. People feel it when they're around him. They feel safe, seen, unjudged. That's the paradox of solitude. When you stop needing love, you start embodying it. You become what you were looking for, but this transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's born from countless quiet evenings, from the ache of missing someone, from the humility of realizing that loneliness is not a flaw, but a mirror. Loneliness shows you where you've forgotten your connection to life. Once he learns that even loneliness becomes sacred, a reminder to turn inward, to return to the source. He may one day find a partner, or he may not. But either way, he will love fully, not with dependency, but with awareness, because for him, love is no longer a destination. It's the way he walks through the world. His solitude has purified his heart. It has taught him that to love is not to possess but to witness. To love is not to seek comfort but to offer peace. To love is not to escape oneself but to share the self that has finally found home within. And that is why the man who lives alone is never truly without love. He carries it quietly within him, steady, deep, unbreakable, like a flame that needs no one to keep it burning. Most people spend their lives searching for someone to complete them. They wander from one relationship to another, carrying the silent hope that maybe this time love will heal what they could not face alone. But love cannot fix what self-awareness ignores. It cannot fill the emptiness that a person has never dared to explore. A man who lives alone without a girlfriend often discovers this truth in the most honest way possible. By being forced to face himself completely without the comfort of another person's presence, he has nowhere to hide. He must meet himself fully with all his strengths and flaws, all his shadows and light. In those quiet evenings when the world goes still, he begins to see how much of life is spent running toward people, goals, noise, anything that keeps us from meeting the silence within. But when there's no one left to run to, he learns the hardest and most liberating truth that no one else can make him whole. Wholeness is not something found in another person's arms. It's something realized within one's own heart. And once he understands that, everything changes. He starts to see that love was never meant to complete anyone. It was meant to be shared between two beings who have already found completion in themselves. When you depend on another to make you feel alive, you give away your power. You turn love into a form of dependency, and dependency always breeds fear. Fear of losing them, fear of not being enough, fear of being alone again. But the man who learns to stand alone faces that fear directly until it dissolves. He learns to be his own companion, his own mirror, his own home. This doesn't mean he rejects love or intimacy. It simply means he no longer seeks it from a place of emptiness. He's not looking for someone to fill the silence. He's already made peace with it. He's not searching for validation. He already knows his worth. He doesn't need a relationship to define him. He allows it to complement him. And that shift in energy changes everything about how he moves through the world. He stops chasing love as a means to escape himself. Instead, he begins to live as love in the way he speaks, in the way he observes life, in the stillness of his being. He becomes whole not because he's detached, but because he's present. When you become whole within yourself, love stops being a need and becomes a gift. You don't demand it, you offer it. You don't fear its absence because you've already found its source inside you. For many, this idea sounds lonely, the thought of being whole alone, but it's not loneliness, it's liberation. It's the end of emotional dependency, the end of needing constant reassurance that you are enough. The man who lives alone learns to be content with his own company. He cooks for himself, not out of necessity, but out of care. He takes walks not to kill time, but to listen to life. He starts to find beauty in the smallest things. A quiet sunrise, a simple cup of tea, the sound of rain on his window. In those moments, he realizes that peace doesn't come from being loved by someone else. It comes from loving the moment you're in. When such a man eventually meets someone, he doesn't enter the relationship out of desperation. He enters it with clarity. He no longer needs to possess or be possessed. He no longer fears loss because he understands that love is not ownership, it's connection. He knows that two whole beings can walk together not because they need each other, but because they choose to. And that kind of love is the only kind that can last. It's easy to fall into the illusion that being with someone will solve everything, that their presence will silence your insecurities and soothe your doubts. But love built on incompleteness is fragile. It cracks under the weight of expectation. To become whole first is to bring strength into love instead of seeking strength from it. The man who has faced solitude knows that wholeness isn't found in another person. It's the soil from which true love can grow. He has learned to sit with himself, to listen to his inner voice, to forgive his past, to understand his own patterns. He has stopped blaming others for what he never healed within himself. In doing so, he discovers that real love doesn't begin when you meet someone else. It begins when you finally meet yourself. Once you've accepted who you are, love becomes effortless. Not because it's easy, but because it's honest. This kind of man no longer carries the anxiety of being alone. Because he knows that solitude is not emptiness, it's alignment. He no longer fears heartbreak because he knows that pain too is part of the expansion of love. He doesn't need to chase or cling. He simply allows life to unfold, trusting that whatever and whoever is meant for him will arrive when the time is right. And when it does, he will meet it from a place of balance. Not need, not fear, but peace. To become whole before becoming two is not a rejection of love. It's the foundation of it. It's the realization that the only way to truly share your life with another is to already be complete within your own. Because love should never be about finding someone to fill your emptiness. It should be about finding someone to share your fullness with, and that is when love finally becomes what it was always meant to be. Not an escape, but a celebration.